They waited for Elijah to fail, certain that he didn't belong here. They wanted to witness the moment he stumbled, fell, wanted to see him embarrassed in front of the whole class. But when Elijah placed his hand on the piano keys, the melody that rose wasn't one of hesitation or confusion. It was a story so powerful that the entire room fell silent, and for the first time, those who had once looked down on him were forced to reconsider. Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas, was a place Elijah Rivers had become all too familiar with in terms of injustice. He wasn't a troublemaker, nor was he the class clown. In fact, he was an excellent student, always turning in assignments on time, with sharp thinking. But no matter how hard he tried, there was one undeniable truth he couldn't escape. He was invisible in the eyes of his teachers. Elijah was used to raising his hand high whenever he knew the answer, only to watch the teacher's gaze pass over him and settle on another student, usually a white one. If he tried harder, waited longer, they would simply pretend not to see him. But that invisibility wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when he made a mistake. If another student, especially a rich white kid with parents who knew the teachers, made a mistake, the teacher would smile and say, "It's okay, try again." But if Elijah made a mistake, not a word of encouragement was said. There was only a long, heavy silence. A silence like an invisible sentence, as if he had just confirmed something they had believed for a long time. He wasn't good enough. Elijah didn't need anyone to say it aloud. He could feel it. Social studies teachers, especially those who taught history and art, seemed to have an invisible bias. They celebrated white students with artistic talent, but never bothered to ask if Elijah had any talents. They eagerly guided white students through discussions of great historical figures, but when Elijah tried to discuss a black figure, they quickly shifted the topic. They encouraged white students to express themselves, but when Elijah tried to do the same, they looked at him as though he were challenging the order they had grown accustomed to. He didn't need anyone to say it. He knew it well. Elijah had never complained, never confronted anyone. Not because he didn't realize this, but because he didn't want to cause trouble. He had once heard his mother say, "The more attention you draw, the more reasons they'll find to hate you. Just do your part." And Elijah did just that. He stayed silent. But what bothered him wasn't being ignored. It wasn't the clear favoritism of the teachers. It was the feeling that they were waiting for him to fail, as if they wanted him to make a mistake, as if he had to make a mistake. And if one day he slipped, they wouldn't miss the chance to prove they were right about him all along. Elijah felt that in every glance, every hollow smile, every long silence. But what they didn't know was that he wasn't going to let them have that moment. The expectation of your failure was always present in the eyes of those teachers, but it had never been as clear as it was today. That morning was just like any other. Elijah sat quietly by the window, his hands quickly flipping through the pages of his book, trying to finish the assignment before class began. He liked the feeling of being prepared, knowing that no matter what anyone thought of him, he always stood firm in who he was. But then, just as he was focusing on finishing the last answer in his notebook, the voice of Miss Richards, one of the oldest history teachers in the school, rang out, breaking the familiar rhythm of the morning. "Elijah, why don't you try answering this question?" The atmosphere in the classroom immediately shifted. The murmurs, the rustling of paper, all stopped. Some students turned their heads to look at him, some in surprise, some in curiosity. Not because the question was difficult, but because this had never happened before. Elijah had never been called on to answer, even though he always raised his hand. But today they were calling on him. Tyler, the only friend in class who showed any interest in him, silently raised an eyebrow as if to ask, "What the hell is going on?" Elijah took a slow breath, sitting up straight, his eyes quickly scanning the board to confirm the question. General Sherman's March to the Sea, he murmured to himself. A topic he had studied before. He knew the answer like the back of his hand. And so, he answered, his voice calm but firm. It was a military campaign led by General William T. Sherman in 1864, with the goal of weakening the Southern Confederacy's economy and morale by destroying their infrastructure and supplies. The classroom remained silent. No one could refute him. The answer was flawless, without a single hesitation or flaw. But instead of nodding in acknowledgement or offering a supportive smile, as they usually did with other students, Ms. Richards simply furrowed her brow, as if re-evaluating something. Then, with a cold tone, she said, "Not bad." That was it. No praise, no recognition. Elijah wasn't surprised, but in that moment he sensed something unusual. It wasn't just the usual bias. It was something more calculated. These teachers weren't just trying to ignore him anymore. They were doing something else. And soon after, it became clearer than ever. Miss Richards flipped through the gradebook, then looked up at the class with a smile that Elijah immediately recognized. This was not a supportive smile, but a purposeful one. "Elijah, tomorrow we'll have a special performance. I heard your grandfather was a skilled pianist. Can you play a piece for the class?" Whispers immediately broke out. Tyler nudged him gently, speaking quietly. "They've never cared about you. And now they want you to play the piano?" Elijah didn't respond right away. He just stared straight into Ms. Richards' eyes, and instantly he understood what was happening. This wasn't an invitation. It was a test, a trap. Elijah had never mentioned his talent for playing the piano. The only thing the teachers knew was that his grandfather had been a jazz pianist, and they had assumed that if Elijah could play, he was just a kid who had picked up a little from someone before him. They didn't expect him to play well. They expected him to fail. He could see it in their eyes. There was no excitement, no genuine expectation. Just waiting. Waiting for a moment where he would embarrass himself. Waiting for proof of the prejudice they had always held in their minds. He can't be better than the other kids we've placed our trust in. From the back of the class, Brandon, one of the rich kids who had mocked Elijah before, sneered, "Oh my God, can you actually play the piano?" A few other students snickered, but Elijah didn't laugh. He didn't need to ask more. He understood their intentions too well. They wanted him to embarrass himself in front of the class. He could refuse, but if he did, they would have a reason to say he was shy, that he had no talent, that they had been right about him. But if he agreed, then he would decide how this game would end. Elijah scanned the classroom. A few eyes were on him, some curious, some waiting, some simply wanting to see the spectacle. He turned back to look at Ms. Richards. Her eyes contained a smug satisfaction, as if she had cornered him into a position where he couldn't escape. But she was wrong. Elijah took a deep breath and nodded. "All right." Ms. Richards' smiles stretched slightly, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of someone who thought they had won. "Good, I'm looking forward to it." But she wasn't the only one looking forward to it, because Elijah had made a decision. He wouldn't just play the piano. He would turn this moment into something they would never forget. Elijah's consent was like a knife cutting through the tense atmosphere in the classroom. As soon as he said, "All right," whispers instantly spread, and a few meaningful glances were exchanged between the students sitting near each other. Meanwhile, at the front of the class, Miss Richards and the other teachers kept their calm expressions, but Elijah noticed something flicker in their eyes. A sense of self-satisfaction. A firm belief that they had achieved what they wanted. They thought he had fallen into their trap. Miss Richards gave a slight nod, her voice authoritative as she spoke. "Very well. I'm looking forward to it. Tomorrow we will enjoy your performance." She emphasized the word enjoy dramatically, as if announcing a comedy show rather than a music performance. Elijah didn't respond, simply staring straight at her. A brief silence passed between them, as if both were waiting to see who would yield first. But Elijah knew that the one in control of this game wasn't them. It was him. When the class ended, Elijah stood up and walked slowly toward the door, feeling the weight of the eyes following his every move. He didn't need to look back. He could already picture the faces of those watching him with a range of emotions. Brandon, the arrogant one, leaning back in his chair with a half-smile as though he was waiting for the moment when Elijah would embarrass himself. Madison, the usually quiet girl, looking at him with confusion, as if unsure of what he would do next. Tyler, the only one who showed any sympathy for Elijah, quickly followed after him as he stepped out of the classroom. Tyler waited until they had walked far enough from the class before speaking in a low, urgent voice. "Are you sure about this? They don't want you to succeed, Elijah. This isn't an opportunity, it's an attack." Elijah knew that well. He knew those teachers didn't want to acknowledge his talent. They didn't believe that a black boy, someone they had always ignored, could actually possess a skill superior to the other students. And above all, they didn't want to be proven wrong. But Elijah also knew something more important. He didn't play music for their recognition. He played because he wanted to. Elijah stopped and turned to look at Tyler, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Then I'll show them something they never saw coming." When he got home, Elijah didn't sit down at the piano as he usually did. He stood still in the living room, looking at his grandfather's old piano, the one that had witnessed countless hours of his relentless practice over the years. This piano wasn't like the one in the classroom, a forgotten tool that probably hadn't been touched by anyone in ages, but that didn't matter. He didn't need a perfect piano to make music. He only needed himself. He closed his eyes, letting his hands glide over the keys, familiar melodies slowly working their way into his mind. In his head, the image of tomorrow's performance appeared clearly, the eyes of the teachers, the anticipation of the class, the skepticism in their every word. And then he realized something. They weren't prepared for what was about to happen, but he was. As Elijah practiced, the teachers behind this trap continued with their plans. In the teacher's lounge, Miss Richards sat with her legs crossed, one hand resting on the table, her voice calm yet full of implication. "I think tomorrow's lesson is going to be interesting." Mr. Bradley, another teacher, smirked slightly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess. He'll hesitate, he'll tremble, and probably forget the melody." A typical performance from a kid who likes attention but has no real talent. Miss Richards just shrugged, saying nothing, but she didn't object, because that's exactly what they expected. She took a sip of her coffee, then spoke casually, as though discussing something obvious. "Elijah Rivers is a smart kid, but that doesn't mean he's special, and tomorrow he'll understand that." In their minds, tomorrow's lesson would be the moment Elijah Rivers would realize there were boundaries he couldn't cross. But they didn't know that they were the ones misjudging the situation. They didn't know that tomorrow wouldn't go as they imagined. They didn't know that Elijah Rivers wasn't afraid, and above all, they didn't know that the boy was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Elijah stepped into the house, closing the door behind him, but his mind couldn't escape what had happened in the class today. Everything had happened so quickly, yet it wasn't a surprise. He had known this would happen sooner or later, but he hadn't expected it to come right now, when he wasn't entirely ready. But was he really not ready? He dropped his bag next to the kitchen table, the smell of food spreading through the small but cozy space of the house. His mother was standing by the stove, gently flipping a piece of fish in an old cast-iron skillet, looking just like every other day, as if nothing special had occurred. But Elijah knew, just by glancing at her face, that she could sense something was different about him. "Is something bothering you, Elijah?" Her voice wasn't too high or too low, but it was enough to pull him out of his swirling thoughts. Elijah hesitated, his mind spinning with whether he should speak up or not, but then he decided there was no point in hiding it anymore. "Not exactly. It's just that tomorrow I have to perform piano in front of the class." His mother turned around, her eyes showing a flicker of surprise, but there was no joy or excitement, like some other parents might express when hearing their child was going to perform in front of the class. She didn't rush to ask him what piece he would play or if he needed help with anything. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, staring at him for a long while before asking, "Perform?" "Yes," he nodded, feeling the lump growing in his throat. "The teacher suggested I play a piece, but I don't think it was a genuine invitation." His mother didn't respond right away, but her gaze suddenly became sharper. She knew far too well how society worked, how there were hidden motives behind actions that seemed harmless. Her son wasn't naive enough to be chosen for his talent out of the kindness of others' hearts. And what do you think they want? Elijah looked down at the table, his hand instinctively tapping a soft rhythm on the wooden surface, a habit whenever he was deep in thought. He took a deep breath, then looked up, his gaze more determined than before. "They want me to fail." The silence between mother and son stretched on for a long time. But Elijah didn't feel anxious or worried. He knew his mother was thinking, weighing every possible outcome. She set the spatula down, sat across from him, rested her elbows on the table, and intertwined her fingers as if preparing to say something important. "So, what are you going to do?" Elijah tightened his grip on his hands, and then smiled softly, not because he felt relieved, but because the answer had been clear to him long before she asked. "I'm going to play music." Dinner passed quietly, more so than usual, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who understood each other, of a mother who knew her son had already found his answer, and of a boy who understood that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he would walk it anyway. After helping his mother clean up, Elijah walked into the living room, where the old piano still held the vibrant sounds of his grandfather. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, but didn't play right away. He stared at his fingers, remembering the days when his grandfather sat beside him, placing his hands over his, guiding him through each note, each pause. His grandfather had once told him, "Music isn't just sound, it's how you tell your story. When they try to silence you, let the music speak." Elijah closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let his hands begin to move. The first notes sounded, gentle but clear, slow but steady. A classic blues melody, like the summer afternoons when his grandfather played while he sat listening, letting the music soak into him. But this time, he wasn't playing for himself. He was preparing for something bigger. Time passed quickly as he lost himself in the music. When he glanced at the clock, it was nearly midnight. Elijah sighed, stood up, gently closed the piano lid, and walked to his bedroom. He wasn't sure if he'd be able to sleep, but he knew tomorrow would be a long day. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what would happen the next morning. He imagined the eyes that would be fixed on him when he walked up to the old piano in the classroom. He saw the image of Mrs. Richards standing with her arms crossed, her face no longer smiling, but instead showing a cold, calculating gaze. He heard the whispers of the other students, some mocking, some curious, others simply wanting to see him make a fool of himself. They thought he would tremble. They thought he'd be so nervous he wouldn't remember a single note. They thought that when his hands touched the keys, he'd lose his way, make a mistake, prove they were right about him from the very beginning. But they were wrong. He wasn't afraid. He couldn't sleep, but that didn't matter. He didn't need a good night's sleep to make a moment memorable. Tomorrow, he wouldn't just play a piece of music. He would tell a story, and he would do it in a way that no one could stop. The next day, as Elijah stepped through the classroom door, he immediately noticed a shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer the aimless hustle and bustle of an ordinary morning, nor the carefree laughter between student groups before class. Today, everything slowed down. Everything felt intentional. Some students gathered in small clusters, whispering to each other, their eyes quickly scanning over Elijah as he walked to his desk. It wasn't positive attention. It wasn't admiration. It was a curious, eager look, as if they were about to witness a humorous performance rather than a serious music piece. Brandon, who always topped the list of those who loved mocking Elijah, was leaning back in his chair, hands behind his head, gazing down at him with that familiar half-smile. "So, are you really going to play for the whole class today?" His voice echoed, deliberately emphasizing each word, as if it were the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. People like Brandon weren't worth wasting breath on. Madison, the quiet girl who usually stayed out of bullying, sat 2 desks away. Her eyes briefly skimmed Elijah before turning away. There was no sarcasm, no clear support, just curiosity. Elijah pulled out his chair, but before he could place his bag on the desk, the classroom door swung open and the group of teachers entered. Their smiles wore a strange shade, a mix of anticipation and a hint of malicious pleasure. They didn't say it, but Elijah could feel it. This wasn't a music performance. This was a public trial, where he was placed under the spotlight where they could define him the way they wanted. Miss Richards, the one leading this game, walked to the teacher's desk, dropped her folder, and spoke in a calm voice but with an undeniable emphasis. "Now, let's see what Elijah can really do." Laughter bubbled from the back of the class. Someone cleared their throat, trying to suppress their excitement. Elijah took a deep breath and stood up. Each step echoed on the old wooden floor, neither fast nor slow, but deliberate. He didn't lower his head. He didn't let anyone see hesitation. The piano sat in the corner of the room, like a forgotten witness. It was old, its paint chipped, some of the keys showing signs of wear. A thin layer of dust covered its surface, as if no one had touched it in years. An instrument left unappreciated, just like the way they had treated him all this time. Elijah placed his hand on the keys. His fingers slid across them, feeling their rough texture, instantly realizing how long it had been since anyone had cared for it. Some notes would be imperfect. Some sounds would not resonate as expected, but that didn't matter. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of silence fill the room, letting every gaze settle upon him. He knew what they were waiting for. A hesitation, a sign of discomfort, a moment of awkwardness. They wouldn't get it. Elijah took a deep breath, opened his eyes, and then he began to play. At first, it was just gentle, deliberate notes, a slow but purposeful blues melody, carrying the essence of summer afternoons he had spent hours sitting next to his grandfather, listening to the sounds flowing from the piano keys. In the classroom, the giggles faded into silence. No one expected this. No one expected his fingers to glide so smoothly. No one expected the melodies to sound so full. Elijah struck a chord, and the sound spread across the room. He could feel the shift in the air, a subtle but unmistakable change. Everyone was listening, even those who had once mocked him, even the teachers who had been waiting for him to fail. He let his hands flow naturally across the keys, letting the melody fill the room, letting it tell the story he wanted to tell. A story without words. A story of perseverance, of struggle, of a child underestimated but never giving up. A story they would never forget. At first, it was just soft, flowing notes. A classic blues melody that his grandfather used to play, carrying the breath of the American South, where deep sounds echoed from small bars, from street corners where unknown musicians poured their souls into each key on the piano. The murmur of laughter in the classroom gradually faded. The whispers disappeared, replaced by an unusually heavy silence. Not the silence of a class listening to a lecture, but the silence of people who had just realized their mistake. Elijah didn't look around, but he felt the shift. No more murmurs, no more gazes filled with anticipation of failure. No one was waiting for him to fail anymore, because they had realized it wasn't going to happen. He closed his eyes, letting his hands continue to move, each note ringing out with unmistakable certainty. This wasn't a boy fumbling with a simple tune. This wasn't a child experimenting with an old, forgotten piano. This was a true musician. He shifted into a more difficult section, letting his fingers glide over the keys with artistry, as if he had practiced it 1,000 times, as if this piano wasn't an instrument left abandoned in the corner of the room, but a part of himself. And then the class was silent. No one expected this. No one. There was a strange moment when Elijah emphasized the difficult chords, the complex transitions that even a skilled player would need to focus intently to execute. But he didn't hesitate. He didn't waver. He knew exactly what he was doing. That was what left everyone in the class confused. Those who had been laughing before now sat up straighter. Not a word was spoken. A few students even leaned forward slightly, as if being pulled into the flow of the sounds filling the room. Brandon, who had always been arrogant and dismissive of Elijah, had stopped laughing. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, but his eyes no longer held ridicule. Instead, there was something close to recognition. Madison, the quiet girl who rarely showed strong emotions, was staring at Elijah's hands on the keys, her eyes wide with amazement. Tyler, the only one who had ever believed Elijah could play, couldn't hide his shock. He knew Elijah could play, but he didn't think he could play like this. No one could have imagined Elijah Rivers, the kid they always ignored, always underestimated, had such a talent. But the strongest reaction wasn't from the students. It was from the teachers. Mrs. Richards, the one who had started all of this, stood frozen by her desk. Her face no longer held a smile. That smile had vanished with the first few notes, the moment she realized things weren't going as planned. She had expected an Elijah who would tremble, who would be anxious and clumsy on the keys. She had believed this would be the moment he made a mistake, that he would stumble, falter, and prove one thing. He didn't belong in this world. But what was unfolding before her eyes was the complete opposite. Elijah wasn't trembling. He wasn't anxious. He was in control of the entire room, and that left her rattled. Elijah continued to play. He let his music spread, letting each melody shatter the prejudices they had once held in their minds. He didn't need to say a word. He didn't need to argue or defend himself. The music was doing all the talking for him. Each note was a statement. Each chord was an answer. Each crescendo was an undeniable challenge. Everyone was listening. Whether they wanted to or not, they had no choice but to listen. And then, What happened next was even more powerful than the silence, something no one in the class could have anticipated. Elijah emphasized a final chord, letting it ring out fully. Then he suddenly stopped. For a moment, the room was plunged into complete stillness. No one moved, no one said a word. And then, from the back of the room, a single clap rang out. At first, it was just one solitary clap, then another, until the entire room was filled with applause. Elijah didn't turn around immediately. He sat there quietly, letting what had just happened settle. And when he looked up, his eyes met Mrs. Richards'. She no longer tried to maintain a smug expression. She couldn't, because in that moment she knew she had lost control. Elijah had turned the tables, but he wasn't done yet. This performance hadn't even reached its peak, and if what he had done so far had been enough to leave everyone silent, what he was about to do next would make it impossible for them to ever forget. Tyler stared at him, mouth agape. He wasn't the only one reacting this way. Brandon, who had once mocked him, crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. His eyes no longer held the same sarcastic tone, but instead showed a more uncertain expression. It wasn't anger nor discomfort, and certainly not full acceptance. It looked as if someone had just been forced to change their perspective on something they'd once been so sure of. Madison, the usually quiet girl, leaned forward slightly as if she didn't want to miss a single detail of what had just happened. Her gaze was no longer just curious. Now, it was filled with admiration. But the most important reaction came from the teachers. They were no longer smiling. The smug grins that had started it all had vanished, replaced by an unmistakable sense of confusion. Ms. Richards stood still, her face expressionless, but her hands were clenched tightly, nails digging into her palms. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. She had orchestrated everything for Elijah to fail, to prove to the class that he wasn't special, that he didn't belong among those who truly had talent. But what was unfolding in front of her was the exact opposite. The other teachers exchanged glances, some frowning, others standing motionless, speechless. They hadn't anticipated that their plan would backfire like this. Elijah hadn't just played well. He had exceeded every expectation. He hadn't just proven that he had the ability. He had done so with such confidence and skill that no one could deny it. He had won, but that didn't mean everyone would easily accept it. The atmosphere in the classroom still hadn't returned to normal. It felt like a guitar string pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. Brandon was the first to break the silence. He cleared his throat, leaned back in his chair, trying to regain some composure, though his voice still sounded awkward. "Well, not bad, Rivers." The words weren't mocking, as usual, but they weren't exactly praise either. It was as if he was trying to maintain his image while facing an undeniable truth. Elijah didn't respond. He simply stared at him, his gaze neither challenging nor expecting recognition from anyone, because he didn't need it. Madison, who had stayed silent the entire time, finally spoke up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly through the tense air. "Wow, no one told us you could play like that, Elijah." "This time," he replied. He shrugged, his tone casual. "Nobody ever asked." There was a ripple of movement in the class. A few students exchanged glances. Some lowered their heads, as if they suddenly realized they had contributed to ignoring Elijah all this time. Miss Richards remained still, but finally she spoke. Her voice no longer held the confidence it had before, but she still tried to maintain the authoritative tone she was known for. "All right, enough. We've spent too much time on this." What she didn't realize was that the class was no longer on the same wavelength as her. A few students looked at each other. Others turned toward her, as if waiting for something fairer. Brandon let out a small laugh, a chuckle that wasn't loud but enough to break the serious atmosphere Miss Richards was trying to hold on to. "Is that it?" he asked, crossing his arms. "You told Elijah to play, he played, and now you want to act like nothing happened." His question, though tinged with sarcasm, made many of the other students nod in agreement. A few murmurs spread. "Yeah, ... Aren't you going to say something? You said you wanted to see if he had talent." Ms. Richards bit her lip. She could feel everything slipping out of her control. Elijah stayed silent. He didn't need to engage in this confrontation. Everything he needed to say, he had already said through his music. Now it was those who had doubted him who were asking for an answer. Miss Richards took a deep breath, regaining her firmness, and spoke in a restrained tone. "Elijah, your performance wasn't bad, but this is a classroom, not a concert. Go back to your seat." Some students were dissatisfied with this response, but Elijah didn't react. He looked directly at her, his gaze holding neither anger nor fear, only absolute calm, and that unsettled her more than anything else. Elijah didn't argue, didn't protest. He simply stood up, walked to his seat with steady steps, each footfall firm as if he still had control over the entire room. As he sat down, Tyler continued to look at him in disbelief. Brandon stared at him with a confused expression, but one thing was certain: the disdain was no longer there. Madison gave him a small nod, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. And Miss Richards, she turned back to the board, trying to re-establish the normal rhythm of the class, but no one was paying attention to the lesson anymore. Because they had just witnessed something unforgettable, something that had completely changed the way they saw Elijah Rivers. And whether they admitted it or not, he had made them rethink everything. The teacher in charge, Ms. Richards, stared at him intently. Her eyes were sharp, as if she were trying to pierce through some kind of facade, searching for a crack, a flaw in what had just transpired. A truth that she couldn't accept lay before her, but she wasn't quite ready to face it yet. Elijah remained seated, his back straight, his hands lightly resting on the desk, his face betraying no hesitation. He didn't look away from her gaze. "Where did you learn this?" Ms. Richards' voice no longer carried the smugness from earlier. Instead, there was an awkwardness that she couldn't mask. Elijah locked eyes with her, his deep brown eyes carrying something that couldn't be expressed in words, but was powerful enough that no one could ignore it. "My grandfather." A fleeting frown passed across Miss Richards' face. A brief, silent moment, as though she had just realized that her preconceptions had been shattered. She didn't know how to respond. Perhaps she had been expecting a different answer, something easier to accept, something more justifiable for her earlier dismissal. Maybe she had thought that Elijah was simply lucky, that someone had trained him briefly, that this was just a random moment. But no, that simple answer, just 3 words, carried a weight too heavy to ignore. My grandfather. A man they had never heard of, a name not found in any textbook, a person they never imagined could produce a talent like this. Elijah saw the hesitation in her eyes, though it was only for a brief second. She didn't want to believe it, but she had no choice but to. The atmosphere in the classroom hadn't returned to normal. If anything, the heavy, strange weight in the air had only grown. The students were still processing what had just happened. Brandon shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed firmly on Elijah, no longer mocking, no longer with that smirk he usually wore. Madison still watched him, but this time it wasn't just curiosity. It was respect. Tyler, the only friend he had in that class, didn't say anything, but the way he nodded lightly when Elijah spoke said it all. Ms. Richards cleared her throat, trying to regain her usual composure, but her voice still lacked the authority it once had. "So, your grandfather was a musician," she said. Elijah kept his calm gaze fixed on her. He wasn't just a musician, he was an artist. The words rang out stronger than anything else, because it wasn't just an answer. It was a statement. Elijah didn't need anyone to accept this truth. He simply stated it. And when he did, it became reality. Ms. Richards went silent for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "All right," she said, her voice attempting to sound normal, but everyone could hear the forced tone in it. "Anyway, it's time to get back to the lesson." She turned her back, facing the whiteboard, as if trying to erase that moment. But there was something she didn't realize. No one in the class could return to normal as before. Some students continued to look at Elijah. Others glanced at each other, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. Elijah didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Everything he needed to say, he had already said through music. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He had just changed the way everyone saw him. Whether they wanted to admit it or not, whether they tried to ignore it or not, they would never look at him the same way again. And for Elijah, that was a victory. After Elijah finished his piece, the classroom was still engulfed in an eerie silence. There were no mocking laughs, no disdainful glances, no shrugged shoulders, or arrogant, sneering smiles. All that remained was an invisible void, a heavy stillness that lingered, as if no one knew how to react to what had just transpired. Before, whenever Elijah spoke or did anything, they could easily ignore him, pretend he didn't exist. But now, after the melodies that had just flowed from his hands, after a performance that shattered every stereotype they had about him, they couldn't turn a blind eye any longer. However, despite the classroom being in shock, there was one person not ready to accept this truth. Ms. Richards, the one who had instigated the whole ordeal, the one who had set the trap for Elijah to fail, stood there with an unreadable expression. She no longer wore the self-satisfied smile she had before, but maintained the same stern attitude as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. After a moment, she raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. Not one of praise or acknowledgement, but simply a calculated reaction from someone unwilling to admit defeat. Not bad," she said, stretching the words as if evaluating something not too important. "But anyone can memorize a song, right?" The class remained silent. A few students glanced at each other, their eyes filled with confusion. Before, every word from Ms. Richards carried weight, easily guiding the thoughts of the entire class. But today, it seemed no one was willing to nod along to her anymore. Some eyes showed clear skepticism, others began to recognize the injustice in her tone, but no one spoke out against her. Only Elijah. He sat there, not angry or upset, not flustered or rushing to respond, simply maintaining a calm yet sharp gaze, his voice not too loud but strong enough to make each word cut through the stifling atmosphere. "If anyone can memorize a song, then why did you expect me to fail?" That question was not just a rebuttal, it was a reversal, a direct blow to what Ms. Richards had been hiding all along. The atmosphere in the classroom shifted immediately, becoming more tense, as if someone had just stretched a string to the point of snapping. A few students murmured, some exclaiming, "Oh," with a mix of surprise and intrigue, because this was the first time anyone dared to directly question the teacher like that. Miss Richards froze for a moment, but quickly regained her usual composure. She hadn't expected Elijah to dare speak like that, not from him, the one who had remained silent for so long, the one she thought would never stand up to her. But she wasn't one to be easily defeated. Clearing her throat, she tried to regain control of the situation, her voice still sharp, but no longer as firm as before. "This is a classroom, Elijah. We don't have time for personal performances." A familiar line, a method she had used many times to shut down any resistance. But this time, it didn't have the same effect. Because this time, Elijah wasn't the only one who saw the absurdity in her words. This time, someone else noticed it too. A sudden voice came from the back of the room, breaking the tense silence. "But you told him to play, didn't you?" All eyes immediately turned to the person who had spoken, Brandon. No one expected this, especially not from him. Brandon, who had been one of the leaders in mocking Elijah, the one who had ridiculed him countless times, was now the one questioning Miss Richards in a way Elijah hadn't even anticipated. Miss Richards blinked slightly, clearly not expecting this betrayal from one of the students she had once thought would always be on her side. The class was no longer silent. Some students began exchanging glances. Others nodded in agreement. What Brandon had said was too clear. There was no need for further analysis. If this wasn't a performance, if the teacher didn't have time for a recital, then why, from the very beginning, did she ask Elijah to perform it? Madison, who rarely spoke up, suddenly chimed in, her voice soft but direct. "I think the same. If he played badly, would you praise him for trying his best?" A ripple spread through the class. Some students looked at each other. Others whispered among themselves. Because for the first time they realized that the teacher's bias was no longer a vague feeling. Miss Richards tightened her lips, her eyes scanning the room quickly, as if searching for a way to regain control, but she couldn't shut down this discussion as easily as before. Another teacher, Mr. Bradley, who had been observing from the back, interjected in a stern but somewhat hurried tone, "We're not here to debate. We need to continue the lesson." But what he didn't realize was that the atmosphere in the room had changed. No one was afraid anymore. No one accepted everything the teacher said as an undeniable truth. They had started to think. They had started to see Elijah differently, and that made the teachers more worried than anything else. Elijah didn't need to say anything more. He simply sat there, his gaze calm but firm, without an overt challenge, yet also without retreat. Ms. Richards knew she couldn't do anything more right now. He had won, not just with music, but with the truth. None of the teachers could answer immediately. They had expected an Elijah to fail, not one who would resist. They had planned for him to become a joke, to prove he wasn't good enough, to show everyone that he didn't belong there. But instead of bowing his head in acceptance, he stood up, played music with all his heart, and shattered the prejudices they had always kept in their minds. Tyler, the friend sitting next to him, turned and whispered, his voice filled with excitement but unable to hide the surprise. "You just made them lose their composure." Elijah didn't need to look up to know that this was true. He could feel the tension that had enveloped the classroom, the awkward glances exchanged, the teachers' eyes meeting each other but none daring to speak right away. They were trying to find a way to regain control of the situation, but they no longer held the reins. He simply smiled lightly, a smile that held no arrogance or challenge, just a sign that he understood exactly what had just happened. He knew he had changed something and he wasn't done yet. Mr. Bradley, one of the most experienced teachers in the group, known for his sternness and order, was the first to regain his voice. He cleared his throat, his eyes quickly scanning the class, and then spoke firmly. "All right, let's get back to the lesson. This is not a debate." Those words rang out, attempting to pull the class back to reality, but no one was really listening anymore. Something had changed, not just in Elijah, but in all the other students in the room. Normally, when a teacher said that, everyone would immediately lower their heads to their books, returning to the lesson as if nothing had happened. But today, no one rushed to do that. Some students were still looking at Elijah, no longer with the scrutinizing or mocking stares as before, but with a silent respect, an acknowledgement that he had just done something no one thought was possible. Madison was still watching him, and for the first time, there was an expression on her face that he had never seen before, a recognition. Brandon crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back in his chair, but he no longer had the smug look he usually wore. He wasn't sneering or making comments. He simply sat there, his eyes still lingering with a hint of confusion, as if he was trying to understand everything Elijah had just done. Though no one said it aloud, one obvious truth hung in the air in that room. Elijah was no longer the invisible kid. He had made them think. And more importantly, the teachers knew he had won. Miss Richards, who had just minutes earlier been in control of everything, no longer held that power. She stood stiffly, her back rigid, her eyes scanning the students as if she was evaluating Elijah's impact. She knew she had lost something, but she didn't show it outwardly. She cleared her throat again, this time more softly, as if trying to attract the class's attention without asking directly. But things were no longer the same. "Let's continue." Her voice was still sharp, maintaining the demeanor of a teacher in control of the class, but the coldness was no longer intact. Normally, when she said that, the class would quickly fall into silence, but today, that silence lingered a little longer, as if everyone was waiting for something else. Elijah opened his notebook, but he knew that no one really cared about the lesson anymore. For the rest of the class, the teachers continued to teach as usual, but no one was truly focused. Some students were still taking notes out of habit, but in their minds they were replaying the melodies Elijah had played, the questions he had asked. He could feel it in the air, sensing the change even though no one said a word. Elijah didn't need anyone to clap or openly admit they were wrong. He didn't need that, because he had achieved what he wanted. He had made them listen. He had made them see him differently. Whether they liked it or not, they would never be able to ignore him the way they used to. And for Elijah, that was more than enough. When the bell rang for the break, the students in the class quickly stood up, packing up their things, but this time, things didn't move at the usual pace. Some students looked at Elijah as he stood up, and there were slight nods from those who had never paid attention to him before. Brandon stood up, slinging his backpack over his shoulder, but before leaving the room, he shot a quick glance at Elijah and muttered something that Elijah barely caught. "Well, not bad." He didn't wait for Elijah to respond and turned to walk out of the class, but Elijah didn't need any public praise. He had heard enough. Tyler gave him a light pat on the shoulder, smiling softly. "So, you're famous now." Elijah just smiled lightly, shaking his head. "Not really." "Not really?" Tyler raised an eyebrow. "You just made them all rethink about you. And I bet the whole school will know about this soon." Elijah didn't answer immediately. He just looked out into the hallway, where some other students were walking by, a few still looking at him with strange glances. Yet, he didn't feel worried, because from this moment on, he was no longer a shadow. Elijah had been seen, and that meant nothing would ever be the same again. Since that day, Elijah had noticed a strange change in the atmosphere of the classroom. On the surface, everything seemed normal. The teacher was still lecturing, students were still taking notes, and the bell signaling the end of class still rang at its usual time. But something had shifted. There was an undercurrent flowing between the people in that room, an invisible struggle that no one spoke about directly, but everyone could feel. The teachers, especially Mrs. Richards, still maintained their composure, but they no longer ignored him as they once had. If before, they could easily pretend he didn't exist, avoid calling on him, and dismiss his answers as if they didn't matter. Now it was no longer that simple. They knew the whole class was watching, but they also didn't want to acknowledge him too easily. He could clearly see the internal tug-of-war within them. On one hand, the desire to maintain control, and on the other, the realization that they could no longer ignore him without facing backlash from the very students they had once controlled with absolute authority. And so, they chose another approach, trying to discourage him. From then on, whenever Elijah raised his hand to speak, the silence would often last longer than usual. They would scan the room, searching for another student to call on first, as if deliberately testing whether he would lower his hand. But Elijah didn't. He kept his hand raised, unwavering, unfazed, simply waiting. Gradually, some of the students began to notice this. If before, no one cared when Elijah was overlooked, now they did. They realized the reluctance in the way the teachers treated him, and they saw that it wasn't random, it was a deliberate choice. One day, during history class, Mrs. Richards stood before the class, lecturing on the Cold War. She posed a challenging question, one she was certain few students could answer right away. Elijah Rivers. This time, she called his name directly, no more beating around the bush or avoiding it as she had before. But her tone had a subtle probing quality, an anticipation, as if she were hoping he would be flustered, unable to answer, lose the confidence he had shown when playing the piano in front of the class. Elijah knew this wasn't a random question. This was a psychological test. She was probing to see if he was truly capable or just lucky in that one moment. She wanted to see if, when placed in an unprepared situation, he would still maintain the poise he had shown when performing. The class went silent, their eyes focused on him. But Elijah didn't falter. He sat up straight, eyes locked on Mrs. Richards, and when he began to speak, his voice was clear, calm, without a hint of hesitation. The tension between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War wasn't just limited to arms or space races. It also involved symbolic confrontations like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. During this period, the U.S. discovered that the Soviet Union was installing ballistic missiles in Cuba, leading to one of the most dangerous moments in modern warfare. Ultimately, after intense negotiations, both sides reached an agreement where the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba and withdrew missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviet Union removing missiles from Cuba. When he finished, the silence lingered a bit longer. But this time, it wasn't his hesitation. It was Mrs. Richards. She had nothing to counter. A few students chuckled softly. Some nodded in admiration. Tyler gave Elijah a light nudge as if to say, "Well done." Brandon, who had once mocked him, now stood with his arms crossed, looking at him with a strange new look. He no longer showed disdain or tried to make jabs. Madison, the ever-observant one, now tilted her head, watching Mrs. Richards with curiosity. Only one person couldn't hide her discomfort. Mrs. Richards. She knew exactly what had just happened. It wasn't just that Elijah had answered correctly. It was the way he answered, unfazed, confident, fearless, his response delivered with certainty and poise. It didn't just prove that he understood the material. It proved that every effort to bring him down was in vain. She stood still for a moment, then nodded curtly, her voice dry. "All right, let's move on." But no matter what she said next, everyone in the class had seen it clearly. Elijah hadn't just stood firm against their challenges. He was forcing them to acknowledge him. And whether they liked it or not, they couldn't do anything about it. What happened in that classroom that day didn't just stay within the four walls of that cramped room. It spread quickly, like a swelling wave through every hallway of the school, through groups of students huddled in conversation during break time, through every lunch table in the cafeteria, through whispers, soft yet filled with curiosity and surprise. Elijah had always been a shadow, an invisible person among the prominent. But since the piano performance, everything had changed. Now, as he walked through the hallways, the glances he received were no longer the same. If before they had looked through him as though he didn't exist, now they truly saw him. There were eyes full of curiosity. Students who had never noticed Elijah before were beginning to take an interest in him. They wondered when he had learned to play the piano, whether he had any other talents they didn't know about. There were quick glances, followed by a turn of the head. Those who had once looked down on him now felt embarrassed for having judged him wrong. They didn't say it, but Elijah could feel their discomfort in the way they avoided his gaze. Some students, who had once only observed from the sidelines, were now trying to approach him in a more natural way. Some pretended to remain indifferent, as though nothing had happened, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't deny that their view of him had changed. Elijah didn't care much about it. He didn't need their recognition, didn't need their attention, but he knew that from now on they wouldn't be able to ignore him so easily anymore. At lunchtime, when he was sitting alone at his usual table, Madison, the quiet girl in class, suddenly walked over and sat across from him. She rarely initiated contact with anyone, but today, there was something in her eyes that Elijah had never seen before. Genuine acknowledgement. She placed her tray down, not rushing to speak, as if choosing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice not loud but clear. "You played like a real artist. Why haven't you said anything before?" Elijah looked at her, a brief smile crossing his lips, not from pride, but from a deep understanding of the world he had lived in all this time. Because no one wanted to listen. Madison didn't immediately argue. She tilted her head, as if thinking over his words, then slowly nodded. But now they have to listen. Elijah didn't reply, but he knew she was right. No one could pretend he didn't exist anymore. It wasn't just the students. Even the teachers couldn't deny this change. They didn't speak of it. But Elijah could see it in their eyes, in the way they looked at him when he entered the classroom, in the way they hesitated for a moment before calling on him to speak. They had lost the invisible power they once had over him. Mrs. Richards could no longer dismiss him when he raised his hand. She still maintained her professional demeanor, still tried to uphold her stern image, but Elijah could see the moments when she hesitated, the times when she had to think harder about how to treat him. Because now, every eye in the classroom was on him. They couldn't continue to behave as they had before, without facing the reactions of students who were beginning to question them. Elijah didn't need them to change completely overnight. He didn't expect an obvious acknowledgement or an apology from anyone. He just needed one thing: they would never be able to ignore him again. And he knew that for sure. One late afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight cast long shadows across the school hallway, Elijah walked slowly toward the main door. Most students had already left, with only a few scattered groups standing around, chatting. The atmosphere was oddly quiet, a strange peace settling over the school after days of tension. He walked without hurrying, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his mind still lingering on the thoughts of everything that had happened over the past few days. But then, a voice called from behind, pulling him back into the present. "Elijah," he stopped. The voice was so familiar that he didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Slowly, he turned. Miss Richards stood there, no longer exuding the usual air of authority, nor did she have the smug smile he had come to know. For the first time, she seemed to stand quietly, as if carefully weighing what she was about to say. Her gaze held no mockery, yet it wasn't one of acknowledgement either. It contained something undefinable, an internal struggle that perhaps even she wasn't ready to admit. For a moment they stood in silence, facing each other in the dimming light. Finally, Miss Richards broke the silence. "You think you've won, don't you?" She spoke slowly, not with a tone of provocation, but not completely soft either. It was as if she was still clinging to the last bit of power she had, still trying to maintain her stance. Elijah didn't respond right away. He looked straight at her, his eyes calm but unafraid. His voice was neither loud nor hurried, but it carried a certainty that no one could deny. "I'm not competing with anyone. I'm just proving the truth." A simple statement, yet it cut through the arrogant facade of Miss Richards like a sharp blade. She didn't counter immediately. Only a long pause lingered between them, a silence that held more meaning than 1,000 words. And then, unexpectedly, she smiled faintly. It wasn't the mocking smile from before, nor was it one of ridicule. It was a smile hard to explain, as if she had heard something interesting, but at the same time knew there was nothing she could say to refute it. "Let's see how far you get with that mindset." Her words weren't threatening, nor were they encouraging. They seemed like a half-hearted remark, a reluctant acknowledgement that Elijah had come further than she ever thought. Elijah didn't reply immediately. He stood still, looking at the woman before him, and in that moment he understood that their battle didn't have a clear winner or loser. He had proven what he needed to prove. He didn't need her acknowledgement, didn't need any praise, didn't need a public recognition. But he knew she understood. She might never say it, might never admit it aloud, but from now on, she would never look at him the same way again. Because Elijah Rivers was no longer the invisible child they could dismiss. He had stepped out of the shadow of doubt, had broken the barriers they had intentionally set up. And whether they liked it or not, they would always remember this moment. She didn't say anything else. She simply nodded briefly, a signal that the conversation was over, and then turned to walk away, her footsteps echoing in the long, quiet hallway. Elijah stood still for a moment, watching her figure fade into the distance, then exhaled slowly. He didn't need to think about what had just happened. He already knew the answer, and more importantly, they knew it too. The next day, when Elijah walked into the classroom, he noticed something different. There were no banners welcoming him, no applause ringing out, and no one stood up to openly admit they were wrong. But that didn't matter, because for him, the change wasn't in the words or grand gestures, but in the way people looked at him. For the first time, he walked into the classroom without feeling the need to prove anything. Not because he thought he was better than anyone else, but because he had done what he set out to do. He had made them listen. They no longer looked at him as an invisible, insignificant child with no value. They no longer ignored him when he raised his hand to speak, no longer expected him to stumble, no longer waited for a chance to mock him. Now, when he raised his hand, the teacher had to pause for a moment, unable to pretend not to see him anymore. When he walked into the classroom, the glances no longer brushed past him but actually stopped, as if they were trying to understand him in a new way. And that was the greatest victory. At lunch, Elijah no longer sat alone as he used to. As he entered the cafeteria, Tyler waved him over to his table, where Madison was also sitting, along with a few other students who had never spoken to him before. They weren't overly eager. They didn't suddenly change their attitudes as if trying to form a fake friendship. They simply accepted him as part of the group. Madison held a juice box, tilting her head slightly as she looked at him, her gaze no longer filled with mere curiosity, but genuine respect. "I still don't get why you never showed your talents before." Elijah just shrugged, offering a small smile. "Because no one wanted to listen." Madison nodded, but this time she didn't need to repeat the answer she had given yesterday. Now, everyone had heard it. Brandon walked past his table. Elijah didn't expect anything from him, didn't need an apology or a compliment. But as Brandon walked by, he gave a slight nod, no sarcasm, no sneering, no challenging look. Just a simple acknowledgement. It didn't have to be a grand change, didn't need a long conversation to explain everything. Just a nod, a brief moment, but it meant more than any words could. Elijah didn't respond, but he knew things were different now. Not everyone could change immediately, but he had done something important. He had made them see him differently. As he turned around from the far corner of the cafeteria, Ms. Richards was watching him. Not with the same control as before, not with judgmental eyes or waiting for him to slip up. This time, she was the one avoiding his gaze. She couldn't deny what had happened. She couldn't deny that he had proven what she once didn't believe. She couldn't deny that, even if she didn't want to admit it, she could no longer ignore him as she had before. For a moment, Elijah thought she might walk over, might say something, might offer a comment, but she didn't. She simply stood there, then turned and walked away, as if finally understanding that some battles couldn't be stretched out forever. Elijah didn't need her to say anything. He already knew the answer. When school ended and he walked out the gates, the evening sunlight lit up the path ahead, and he felt a strange sense of relief that he had never felt before. Not because he had changed the world, not because he had made everyone his friend, not because he had received validation from all, but because he no longer had to hide who he was. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to fight to be seen. He just needed to do what he did best and let his talents speak for themselves. And he knew that was something no one could take away from him. Elijah had started this story as an invisible boy, underestimated, ignored, and challenged by those who didn't believe in his abilities. But with talent, persistence, and courage, he had changed the way people saw him. No yelling, no arguing. He let his music and intellect do the talking, and that said it all. Elijah's story wasn't just about a piano performance. It was about fairness, self-affirmation, and how we can break through prejudices by being our true selves. Sometimes, to change how others see you, you don't need to prove anything to them. You just need to do the best at what you're best at. What about you? Have you ever had to face someone who didn't believe in your abilities? And what did you do to prove your worth? Share your story in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to not miss out on future meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.